Okay, I'm going to now move us on to our second keynote speaker, Jason Alexandra. Jason is a research and policy professional with a career spanning over 35 years in the government, private and NGO sectors, focused on the environment, natural resources and sustainability. Thankfully, Jason is a communicator capable of synthesising and conveying research and policy changes to diverse audiences, grounded by practical experience in commercial scale revegetation, intensive agriculture and horticulture, forestry and farming, having owned and operated intensive horticulture and irrigation-based farming businesses since the early 1980s. He doesn't look old enough. Let's give Jason a warm welcome as he comes to the lectern to present the topic of changing the landscapes, mindscapes and waterscapes of the Anthropocene.
Thank you very much. Well, the presentation's coming up. Thanks to the organisers. Thanks to Rick for a really good outline of some of the practical and policy problems we're facing. And given that introduction, I thought rather than going to the PowerPoint, I'd just talk a little bit about, Rick talked about implicit racism. I think there's a fair bit of explicit racism in government. So I thought I'd just give two little accounts of my own experience of it. In Victoria, we have a government that's very proud that it's negotiating a treaty. I'm on the board of a Victorian statutory authority. I chair one of its committees. And at the opening of the meetings, I decided that the standard welcome to country statements just weren't strong enough. And we have heard already, or we've had some pretty good welcome to country here. So at these meetings, I said that I respect elders past, present and emerging, and would like to acknowledge that they didn't cede their territory willingly, which I thought was, factually correct. And for about a year, this was minuted in official government documents. One time I was away from a board meeting and there was an item on the discussion about formalising the way we do this ritual acknowledgement, and the words to be used were codified into the polite form of this statement in order to avoid the hard facts. That's one little story. Now, the other one is when I went to work in Canberra back in 2008 with the Murray-Darling Basin Commission, I knew full well that the Commission had spent quite a lot of money getting a major piece of research done to understand its legal and human rights obligations to Indigenous people in the basin. And I knew this because Donna Craig, who's a lawyer who led the project, is a friend of mine. So I started asking around the office, I would like a copy of these reports. There was 4 volumes of reports, very, very thorough piece of work, good legal analysis, and nobody could find them. They were only done a couple of years earlier. So in the end, I rang Donna and I said, look, Donna, I know you did this fantastic work. Nobody here knows anything about it or can even find the documents. Would you just send them to me? And within a day, I had them emailed to me and I asked somebody to print them out. And I went to the executive meeting and I said, I think we actually have a significant piece of work to do here, at least in understanding this, particularly before the Commission becomes a Commonwealth authority, because a Commonwealth authority has national and international obligations to meet. I was told pretty bluntly, that it was none of my business and that it wasn't in my area of responsibility. Now, this, I think, is an example of, we could call it blindness, blurring, burial of facts, avoidance of obligations, unwillingness to face the truth, or what was referred to as the Great Australian Silence. Now, there's a beautiful picture of some people jumping into the Murray over there, and I know the Murray is incredibly important to South Australians. In the 2007 Water Act, the Commonwealth reformed the underlying laws about how the states and the people of Australia must manage the Murray-Darling system. And there is a clause that says that all of the work must take into account Indigenous interests in water. Now, what does an Indigenous interest in water actually mean? and what actually happened between 2007 with the enactment and we're now 12 years later. Well, I can tell you that the Commonwealth has spent at least, or most of $13 billion on fundamental reforms to water property rights in this country. Out of that $13 billion, when it is fully spent, so some of it's still to be spent, about $8 billion has gone directly to irrigators and the water agencies to deal with things like fixing channels and so on. About $4 billion has gone to buying water rights to be used as environmental water held by the Commonwealth. And I may be wrong, but roughly orders of magnitude, about $2 million has gone to a research program into what cultural water actually means. And most of that money actually went to universities and government agencies. So again, we can see that this, we can call it intrinsic bias, is deeply ingrained in the way government does business. Now, I don't despair because I think there is enormous hope for change and I'll call it persistence in getting some of this addressed. Okay, now I'll go into the talk I prepared before coming here. Like Rick, if anybody wants to talk to me while I'm here through the day, unfortunately I have to leave later today. I'm more than welcome to. And I think we have a chance as a panel to talk about these things. But the Murray-Darling story, which is a big part of what I've done and worked on, is another story, and it's not the one that I came here to talk or prepared to talk about. Okay, so Landcare and the Anthropocene, and what are we faced with? Are we looking backward with ideas of ecological restoration? Or are we looking forward to what I call designer ecosystems? What is this concept of the Anthropocene? It simply means that we are in an age, it's the epoch of humanity. The dominant force that's shaping the earth is the sheer number of humans on it and what we do. And the evidence of this human influence can be found in the strata, whether it's in the plastics that are going to be in the next lot of sandstones that are formed, or nuclear particles, or the changing in the atmosphere, the amount of carbon dioxide. What's the problem? Well, I think it's like this. There's somewhere between, we're going to deal with between 7 to 9 billion people. I mean, roughly, you come through this country, I drove from Melbourne yesterday, magnificent agricultural land. The whole of Australia, the calculation is it feeds about 60 million people. So how are we going to deal with this, with the need to reduce carbon emissions, intense competition for land and water, looking after nature and biodiversity, and transforming economies when we deal with the fact that there's no longer cheap and abundant oil? Well, since the 70s, there's been this mantra, think global and act local. And most global problems, large-scale global problems, don't need global solutions. There are some, but most of them need local solutions, and lots of them implemented faster, more effectively. And we know from lots of practical experience, whether it's the parks that Rick was talking about or the Landcare groups around here, that when people have their hands on the job and steer what they're doing, it's most useful. Now that sounds like Landcare to me. And I think we also have to deal with this fundamental question. Are we talking about conservation through including people or through excluding people? And the model that's based on excluding people is this sort of strange idea that people can't be trusted with their resources. And to me, that sounds like a continuation of the colonial approach. You've got to get people, if you want to look after country, you've got to get rid of the people. That's pretty strange. Okay, so Landcare as a model. It is working in many countries and in many contexts. So what is Landcare? Well, it's a philosophy. It's got a set of principles. There's a whole lot of different practices. There are policies, there are programs, and of course there's the people. And in one sense, I like to think of it as a global movement that's trying to integrate culture, conservation, and production. Now, I think Rick said the same thing a little bit differently, but there is no wilderness. Landcare as a national program, as we've heard, is 30 years old, but a practice, I think we can say it's 60,000 years old, and that all of Australia's landscapes have been shaped by countless generations of human use and occupation. If we accept that, it just fundamentally challenges the notion that conservation can be based on the ideal of wilderness. You know, this idea of a landscape untouched or not influenced by humans and what they do. And therefore, if we use benchmarks of natural ecosystems free of human influence, we're actually, again, continuing that kind of blindness that I referred to earlier. Now, so this, is it a new or old philosophy? Doesn't matter much, but this idea of integrating culture, nature and production seems to be central to the Landcare model. And to go back to my earlier slide, a constrained world needs people who know how to integrate conservation and production. We also, as I said, we need to recognise that all landscapes are cultural landscapes, at least in Australia, and that these landscapes, they're not just about the physical, the dirt and the water and the trees, they're about governance, about law and about knowledge. And if we go to the legislation that set up the national estate in Australia, when we talk about something being of the national estate, it actually refers to landscapes as being both cultural and natural. Now I want to go a brief case study just a little bit north of where Rick's been working, the Fitzroy River in Western Australia. I'm doing a little bit of work for a council formed there of 7 native title groups. It's regarded as an iconic, free-flowing tropical river of international significance. The whole landscape is rich in Indigenous cultural and natural values that are recognised in National Heritage listing. The listing's supported by a large cohort of scientists, and if you want to look at a beautifully fashioned statement of support, go to this Fitzroy River Science Statement. The traditional owners have released their own statement, which is in the Fitzroy River Declaration, which talks about their aims and aspirations and what they would like to see, and they are currently developing a management plan for the entire rich catchment based on traditional and environmental values, or we could say traditional law, knowledge and values. Here's a couple of the workshops that I've been involved in. 2015, very, very open question, how are we going to improve participation and local governance in water? There was big concerns, a bit like the mining. There's concerns about mining. There's big concerns about irrigation development. Guess who one of the key proponents is for that irrigation? She's already been mentioned here today, Gina Reinhardt. But not just Gina, some of the big cotton growers from the Darling as well. And the West Australian Government has committed to a water allocation plan to be completed sometime next year. Now, the second workshop actually looked at exploring alternative development pathways and transformative futures for the Kimberley, where the people are saying, we want economic development, but we want the kind of economic development that's appropriate to our needs and values, not one that's imposed in terms of big resource developments. I could speak for the whole day on the Murray-Darling Basin or on the Fitzroy, but I'm going to try not to. The point is that wherever we are, nature and culture are intertwined and co-evolved, and this has got profound implications. So we need to recognise the landscapes we're working in as places where there are assemblages of culture, knowledge, law, governance, and material and spiritual connections. These things aren't separate, but when we look at a lot of our laws, we tend to separate them. And once we try to put them together, it can be central to our theories and practices of landcare. And it has ethical and philosophical and pragmatic dimensions in the way we understand and govern landscapes. And I guess the key message I want to put is the way that we think and see the world affects the way we behave in the world. And I'll come back to that later. Now, just trying to race through. I was asked to help out write this a year or so ago with Andrew Campbell and David Curtis. It was a chance to think about what has happened over those 4 decades. And this is a bit of a history of the Landcare story. We've already heard a bit about Joan Kerner and Heather Mitchell, Rick Farley and Philip Toyne. It's important to recognise that Landcare didn't just start in Victoria. It actually was emerging in Western Australia, in Queensland and lots of other places. It was happening it emerged from the ground, and then it became codified in big names and Commonwealth programs. And what was happening in the 70s and 80s is there was just a widespread concern about the state of the continent: erosion, rangelands decline, tree dieback, salinity. And this alarmed rural communities and the public. And that led to these community action groups. There was one in north central Victoria called SALT, and they advocated for large-scale reforestation. But if we track that history, we can see it happening in lots of places. And then in the SALT action one, we had a major re-veg program in the early 80s, which led to this big employment program, which actually was the forerunner, the first one we can find, of subsequent Landcare employment programs. And there's been lots of them. And we've already heard part of the problem is the stop-start funding with these programs. By the late 80s, the ACF, so under Philip's guidance, the National Farmers Federation under Rick, called for a decade of Landcare, focusing on the end of land degradation and restoring landscapes. They only asked for a decade, and we've already had 3, which is pretty good. But the important thing is that Hawke was a strong advocate of consensus politics. So when the National Farmers and the ACF came together and said he couldn't resist it, it was just perfect kind of symmetry. And we've already heard about the launch symbolically on the confluence of the Murray and Darling rivers. Now, this became the beginning of greater Commonwealth involvement. The Commonwealth has no constitutional powers over land and water management, but they have money. And a friend of mine said last week, money doesn't only speak, it swears. Okay, so we got all these once you had a lot of Commonwealth money, everybody became interested, the research organisations, state and local government, etc. And but actually what was going on was there's still lots of clearing for agricultural development in most states, and South Australia was the first state to bring in clearing controls, followed by others. South Australia was also the first state to bring in a cap on using water in the Murray, which still we don't seem to have achieved in several other states. Okay, so we've had this, not only money, but this culture of landscape restoration or land care, and it's affected the nation's relationship with the continent, and it's enthused communities, and it's basically happening all over the place. And in setting out to change landscapes, we actually changed ourselves as people. Hopefully we changed ourselves. Don't worry about the small print, but there's an example of the stop-start programs. But the important thing is it's bipartisan support. And I picked this slide to here because that's the pot of gold at the end of the rainbows in the sacred site of the MCG, and there's the old Treasury building where the actual gold used to go to. And it's like, if you have huge public support, bipartisanship will follow, right? The reason governments keep funding it is because they get told by stalwarts of the National Party, the Labor Party, the Liberal Party, and whoever else that Landcare is great. Okay, now I'm going to move a bit globally, move into the global question. I think it was called big picture thinking, not much bigger picture than this. I guess we could get cosmic, but that's not for me. Landcare is what I call a hitchhiking hybrid. It's moving around the world, and I'll try to show you some evidence of it. I was lucky enough to be invited to run a course in Zambia a couple of years ago. In that course, we had representatives from 16 sub-Saharan African countries. It's Emily from Namibia giving her talk. They said to me, I got to know them pretty well that week, they said to me, you have to go back to Australia and tell your government the best thing Africans have ever got out of Australia is the Landcare model. We are using it in lots and lots of countries in lots and lots of ways, but there's almost no Commonwealth support. There's limited Commonwealth support for this transmission. I ran this course as a volunteer, and most of the people involved in doing that work do it as volunteers. Right, so that's all right. In a way, Landcare's effectiveness has always been that it's viral, that it infects territories, people, through things like workshops and training courses. Ideas circulate through cross-pollinators. It's a nice thing to be called a cross-pollinator. Now, just to give you an idea of this, there's this emergence of this Pan-African Landcare network that are making massive proposals to do landscape and catchment restoration. I've already said these big-scale problems need lots of local solutions, but lots of techniques have been proven and can be scaled up. Now, in preparing my talk, I actually got this, that previous picture was Dennis Garrity. I got this email 2019 from Dennis about the launch of the Evergreening the Earth campaign. Don't worry about the detail, but the main thing is the approach of the campaign is to empower communities through a Landcare approach that engages them in scaling up solutions. Right, they're planning on, I can't remember how big it is, but it's revegetation on a huge scale across Africa and elsewhere, and people are explicitly acknowledging it, that they're basing it on this Australian model. Now, I thought I would go the other way. This is two satellite images of where we were running this course in Zambia, 86, 2011, showing the growth of the town and agriculture and the copper mines in that area. And these changes, when we look at them over decades, are dramatic. And we conclude from that we are actually small little humans. We're forming this, or we're reshaping the earth. We're like ants or termites. And there's lots of us. What we did in that course was we got hold of a whole lot of Landcare principles that have been published elsewhere in the world to see how it's been interpreted. These are the ones from Japan. Landcare groups focus on local issues. They're autonomous. They operate on their own initiative. That sounds like anarchy to me, or maybe democracy. And it's aligned with the Jeffersonian ideal of self-help. Self-sufficiency, self-government, individual responsibility. These are central to the Jeffersonian worldview. You know, we don't need to rely always on government to get things done, or central governments. Okay. This is again still from Japan. They address local issues. The groups focus on conservation or restoration and the well-being of local communities, and they do partnershipping and networking. And in the process of running the course, we did some partnershipping and networking, and this was going to a small local community, and the locals were exchanging ideas about how to do better land management and how to meet their own needs. And there's this focus on farmer-to-farmer extension. But it's not just farmer-to-farmer extension, it includes working with governments and targeted education and training, etc. Now, there's a whole lot more of these principles, and for time I might just flick through them quickly, but integrated natural resource management, deal with causes of problems, a participatory approach, sustainable livelihoods, an empowerment model is probably useful. This idea that you will have heard about bottom-up, top-down, an institutional framework that blends appropriate policy with bottom-up feedback that give voice to people. We can restate them simply: community-based local groups for decisions and actions, improving resource management for production and conservation. The idea of combining production and conservation was central to the Landcare proposal in '89. My colleague Rowan Reed's just written a book about how to do it with trees. I think the subtitle is The Art and Science of Growing Trees for Conservation and Profit. So the same concept is being explored, and yet I think in practice a whole lot of these things are being polarised between this is about conservation, that's about production. A friend of mine calls that the apartheid model of landscape management. I really like this. Landcare plans are about implementation. They are literally about getting stuff done. There's a lot of plans out there. I mentioned the Matawarra and working on the plan there. I was talking to people who commissioned me to do it last week, and I said, the problem with rivers, as far as I know, is not any single river has ever read a river or catchment management plan, and if they have, they don't obey them, right? So a catchment or a river plan is really about managing us, not about managing rivers. Now, the other thing is what's in a name. Landcare's a pretty broad church. We could call it all these different things, and the important thing more is these central concepts or approaches. It's nice to have a brand that gets us together, but we can spend a lot of time arguing as to whether my brand, I might call it permaculture, or I'm a revegetationist, or a tree farmer, or whatever. And so Landcare's been quite successful in Australia, keeping this broad church together. And as I mentioned, and getting people to work together. So like ants or termites, if we work collectively, we're capable of huge changes through lots of small actions. Okay, back to the central, what I call the design brief. How are we going to go about sustaining all these people in this highly constrained world? And where do we look for solutions? Well, I started with this, adapt or else. 5 minutes? Good, thank you. Now, adapt or else. Why? Well, we have all heard about climate change. It is getting hotter and drier. The science tells us there's going to be less water in the rivers. Everywhere we go, there's armies of machinery reshaping the earth. All the rivers, nearly all the rivers have been modified like that. There's lots of this used for food and fibre production. We need to transform landscapes. And we need to recognise that our landscape or our agriculture seems to be moving into big scale or boutique scale production. Global capital tends to go to intensive production where there are high returns, like that or like this. At the same time, organisations like the Food and Agricultural Organisation are promoting Agro Ecology, which is based on ideas about these beneficial relationships between people and ecosystems, and the ideas of sort of maximising this through a design approach, which sounds like permaculture to me. And that everywhere we go, we really need to be thinking that there are basically millions of villages that are involved in billions of gardens. That's how we're going to sustain our needs. Oh, I've got that one wrong. Another main point I wanted to make was that Landcare's been formative in both agricultural and urban areas to get people to innovate and to think about diverse approaches. Think and try them. And I'm just going to flick. I think we've got these biodiversity conservation challenges. I've mentioned that we've got approaches that really sound like design or redesign. And I like to think we need to start thinking of our farms as forests, and then we might get somewhere. And from an ecological point of view, I think it's not that complicated. If we add diversity and structure, we get habitat, and the other things will come. We can bring back biodiversity. We can use animals as soil builders in lots of different ways, like this way. And we should be thinking about the little things like fungi, because they're all over the world and they play big, big roles in what's going on. And we also need to think about making sure our food supply systems are biodiverse. And there's all this technical or technological innovation in the way food's being grown going on. And the thing about Landcare is it's inspiring people to work in and with living landscapes. Trees are part of it, I've already mentioned that. But it's not just because we like trees. When we think about it, they actually do stuff. They intercept these global cycles like the carbon cycle, the water cycle, etc. And they can be the powerhouses of the new bioeconomy. So I'm just about there. Landcare works by inspiring real change and the sharing of learnings of what works for people and the planet. It's helped to redefine, reinterpret, reconceive, rethink about how we work in landscapes. It's promoted new and old ideas about integrating production and conservation. And it's built capacity for people to partner and adapt to new circumstances, including new climates. There's lots of legal and policy innovations happening. I heard some fantastic ones in the uplands of Uganda. We'll talk about them later. And that it's a good time, I think we're introduced to this idea of looking backwards, looking forwards. We really need to be reflecting on change and also be willing to change our reflections. As I said, the way we think affects how we behave in the world. The way we see and think affects how we see the world. And our landscapes aren't just factories from which we seek sustainable production, even though that's important. They're also museums, art galleries and cathedrals. Thank you very much.
I was conscious I could feel the energy in the audience that they want to ask questions or make comments, because I could sort of...
Well, let's go.
So yeah, so we've got 10 minutes, questions. Right. So please give me some questions now for Jason. That was fantastic. Who's going to start me off? Somebody at the back, probably.
Surely you don't all...
No.
You don't all agree with me.
Silence. Here we go. Thank you.
Hi Jason, thanks for covered a lot of turf in a very short period of time. So Glenn Christie from Succession Ecology. I'm really interested in this whole concept of the plants and plants potentially doing the bulk of the heavy lifting in the work for us. You had a really interesting slide there, but which we don't see very often. You talked about fungi, and I'm a bit of a fan of lichens and soil crusts. Could you talk to that in terms of how they can help us, please?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it. I was about to say I'm an amateur ecologist and a first-rate bullshit artist, but the way I understand it is that a whole lot of the tiny little processes, the invisible processes or the barely visible one. I mean, the thing I like about fungi is that's a picture from where I live in Gippsland. In the autumn, after rain, suddenly you get this explosion of really interesting fruiting bodies, but what's been going on all year? So there's all this stuff happening, not visible. It's like being a really good environmental activist. You can be not visible a lot of the time or whatever kind of activist and pop up under the right circumstances and then spread your spores all over the place, right? And influence the way things happen. These fungi, I think that's a picture of the Australian oyster mushroom, but apparently they're kind of global and their spores spread around globally, but then they morph and their DNA is a bit flexible and they adapt to local circumstances. Sounds like a pretty good analogy, doesn't it? But they also drive a whole lot of underlying processes. And I guess when we think about the plants doing the heavy lifting, for example, if we plant a whole lot of trees and provide a whole lot of woody biomass, a whole lot of those fungi, if it's suitable, will move in and restore that landscape. So it's really, if we think of it from an applied point of view, what can we do? I guess we can spread fungi around, but if the conditions aren't suitable, they won't grow. But if we change the conditions to they're suitable, they're likely to come. Or they're there, they're going to thrive. I'm not sure if that's...
Thank you. Okay, time for another question or comment or reaction. Anybody?
There's one up the back.
Oh, yeah, here we go.
Thanks, Jason. Picking up on a point you made about your analogy of being quiet and inactive and then mobilising and speaking up and having something to say. We've had a number of programs, including the Billion Trees program and other programs that you'd be well familiar with. Just wondering I feel like now's the time that we collectively as Landcarers could speak up, potentially to the federal government. There's quite a bit going on at the local and state level, but federal government in particular, about the need for biodiverse carbon plantings at a very large scale and how we might go about doing that.
It's a long time since I've been involved directly in lobbying or advocacy, but you only have to read the newspapers to realise that the current government has a fairly poor reputation on a whole lot of fronts, and that the public are deeply concerned about a whole lot of environmental issues. So given those two circumstances, it probably is an ideal time to do that kind of lobbying. I think, however, we have to be very careful, a bit like my story about the crumbs. You know, a lot of program funding is really the crumbs of much deeper, they're the crumbs of deeper, you know, the story of 13, it's actually, we calculated in the Murray-Darling, it's been more like $20 billion, but a whole lot of the fundamental property rights issues haven't been resolved. And we're talking about a very big continent with a lot of bankable resources. If we want to have large-scale change, we have to have bold policies that are supported by big programs, not by little programs. So a lot of the time we see a program where the scale of the announcement and the scale of the funding is just completely mismatched to the scale of the issue being dealt with. So, you know, I don't want to sound cynical, but that sounds like window dressing to me. So if you are going to ask for something from a big government, like a central government, ask for something really big. Be bold. The original ACF NFF proposal, which I still have a copy of somewhere in my, I call it my deep litter filing system, you know, just piles and piles of paper. And I refer to myself as a bit like a free-range chook. When I want something, I scratch around long enough and find it. But I have a copy of that little, it's about 6 or 8 pages. It's very pithy. It explains very clearly why we don't need more inquiries. I think it starts with the line, there have been 16 national inquiries into land degradation in Australia in the last decade, and they all recommend whatever, bold action. Right, so if you are, I mean, it's harder now because we've had 30 years of Landcare. We've had 30 years of Landcare. We haven't ended land degradation. We have mobilised people. We can see small signs of success. What about turning the small signs of success into big signs of success?
Okay, I've got another question here.
I don't want this sound negative. There's a lot of information there, and this is only a complex information. It's very simple, so I'm 56. So 30 years ago, at 26, there was Landcare. I remember a huge amount of energy, and I don't think I went to a Landcare conference back then, but I sort of wonder. Over that period, a lot has been achieved, but I don't know whether it doesn't seem as much energy, perhaps, for it as what there is. But I mean, I brought my 12-year-old today, and I'm not sure who the next oldest is in the room, but there'd be a bit of difference there. But and those that we were at a workshop yesterday, and those that were there, as far as trying to encourage energy in Landcare and younger people, and the Landcare conference doesn't need a junior sort of part where people do colouring in or whatever, because the people who were there yesterday said the mix very intelligent and had good input and ideas for the session that we had yesterday. But anyway, but I'd just like to see more energy, sort of working out ways to get more energy to Landcare, and perhaps the way to do that is to aim for that at the youth. So.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's absolutely critical. One of the refreshing things was that throughout places like Uganda, they have really vast junior Landcare programs. Primary schools have nurseries. They're all taught and involved in it and so on. But I also think to compare what was happening 30 years ago with what's happening now, well, I was a little bit older than you, but not much. But, when I reflect back on it, I mean, we had bold, energetic politicians like Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. We had bold leaders from NGOs. We had a willingness to take on bold strategic things. At the moment, I see most governing as about mere survival to the next leadership challenge, and people keeping their heads down because they're worried about it'll be chopped off. And in inside government agencies, the same thing. Don't speak out, don't take risks. Inside corporations, etc. So I guess if you just, part of the reason I put the thing about the, Jeffersonian ideals, if you think about it, one thing we can do is just speak more boldly in whatever circumstances we're in about what we think needs to happen. Not just rely on the idea that it has to come from something big at the government level. And the same thing, think about it, if the Landcare environment movement was emerging in the 70s and 80s, it actually took a long time to get to the point where it was picked up and announced by the politicians.
Brilliant words. Speak boldly. I love that. I'm going to squeeze in one more question. We might run over time. Make it quick.
Thank you, Jason, for a very good presentation. The current flavour of the month, let's put it that way, is now regenerative agriculture.
Yeah.
Your comments on where that could lead, because I can see that it's going to create another divide, particularly within the farming communities.
Yeah, I mentioned to somebody the other day, it used to be sustainable or whatever, now it's regenerative, but once things become popular, everything's regenerative, In fact, we are at a cellular level all being regenerative right now, right? So everybody and everything is regenerating constantly, or else we'd be dead. So I'm not trivialising it. I think just regenerative agriculture, I get a lot of the guff on it, and it just sounds like it's the same old thing. But at least it's an expression that there's this ideal that we don't just want to be exploiting things. We want to, if you like, fix it or whatever. So I think it's great. And that's why I put the slide in about the broad church, You want to argue with me about whether, is Landcare better than regenerative agriculture or vice versa? It's a waste of breath.
You're so nervous about running over time, aren't you? I'm edging in on you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
That's brilliant. You've crammed a lot into that session, and I think we all really appreciate it.
Thank you.